Go.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Writer Mother Monster. I'm your host, Laura Ehrlich, and our guest tonight is Lori Tharps. Before I introduce Lori, I want to thank you all for tuning in, as always, and let you know that you can now listen to Writer Mother Monster as a podcast on all major audio platforms or read the interview transcripts on writermothermonster.com. And if you enjoy the episode, please consider becoming a Writer Mother Monster patron or patroness on Patreon. Your support helps make this series possible. Please also chat with us during the interview. Your comments and questions will appear in our broadcast studio, and we'll weave them into our conversation. And now I'm excited to introduce Lori. Lori L. Tharps' work meets at the intersection of race and real life. She is an author, journalist, educator, podcast host, and popular speaker who is inspired by the collision of culture and color and fueled by creativity and passion. Lori has served as a writer and/or editor for magazines including Glamour, Parents, and Essence, and has written for The New York Times, TheRoot.com, The Washington Post, and many others. She's the author of 3 nonfiction books, Hair Story, Untangling the Roots of Black Hair in America, Kinky Gazpacho, Life, Love, and Spain, and Same Family, Different Colors, Confronting Colorism in America's Diverse Families. And she's the author of the novel Substitute Me. Lori has 3 kids and describes motherhood in 3 words as inspiring and exhausting. I agree. Welcome, Lori.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
It's great to have you. I'm so excited to meet you in person here. So tell us about your 3 kids. How old are they?
Sure. My eldest is 19. It's so crazy to say that. And then I have a 16-year-old. I'm like, 19, 16, and 9.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, and we were talking before we came online here about those different ages, and you were telling me, which I was a little dismayed to hear, that it's still hard when your kids are older. I mentioned my daughter is 4. Yeah, tell me why I'm sure between 9 and 19, there's all different kinds of difficulty.
Yeah, well, I guess the first thing I want to say is that I remember when I had my first son, I lived in New York City. I was working at a magazine. I was working at Entertainment Weekly magazine, and I was loving my life. And it never occurred to me that I couldn't continue my career as a journalist just because I had a kid. And like at that point, I felt like anything seemed possible in New York City in the late 90s, right? And yeah, I just thought I was going to get a nanny, life was going to go on. But and the other thing was that I met a lot of women who had said, "Oh, I was a writer too, and then I had kids and I couldn't anymore." So that was kind of my like, "Oh, that's not going to be me." It wasn't fear; it was more like, "Well, that's not going to be me. I'm just going to figure it out. Clearly, these people just don't have enough creativity or something." And then I had my son, and I remember the first year of his life, I wrote 1 article, and it took me like the whole year. And I thought, oh, this is what they meant. I just remember thinking like, there's no way this is ever going to work because this baby sleeps in 20-minute spurts, and then I'm trying to take a nap. Like I just thought nothing was going to work. But once he hit the 1-year mark, I had actually written my first book right before he was born. So my book came out in February of 2001, my first book, Hair Story, and my son was born in June of 2001. And then I had my second son in 2004, so 3 years apart. And I wrote my novel when my second son was, I'm lying, I wrote a memoir first, sorry. I can't remember the order. I just remember
That's okay.
The way that I wrote I remember that I paid for a nanny to watch when my second son was a very young baby. I could afford a nanny for like 4 hours a week. No, maybe like 4 hours a day, 3 times a week. That's all I could afford. And that's what I said, okay, so I'm going to write this book when I have this time. So when my children were really young, like babies or, kind of baby daycare age, I could figure out how to write because I could farm them out for a certain amount of time. It was small spurts of time, but I told myself if I could just get them to leave, somebody else, or if I could leave, actually, I could just disappear, that I had these very specific hours, and I just forced myself to become a very efficient writer. Mm-hmm. So I never felt like I had enough time to do all the things I wanted to in terms of like being a writer, but I knew I wanted to finish a book or an article or whatever it was I was working on. I could hire somebody or get somebody to watch my children, and they were literally out of sight, out of mind. As they got older, however, the distraction of children becomes not just their physical presence, but their issues. They need more. They need more than a babysitter who could take them away and let them play in the park for a few hours so you can work. They need you to help them with their homework. They need you to help them deal with social issues. They have, events, or like classes that they have to go to, extracurriculars, and you want to be a good parent. So of course you sign them up for extracurriculars or whatever it might be, even if you try to be the parent like me, who's like, yeah, I only need to do one thing. I'm not going to be that overscheduling parent. So as their lives become more complicated, it becomes harder to make them disappear so you can have time to write.
Yeah. Oh, I'm looking forward to that. Yeah.
That was my big mistake.
Oh my gosh. Tell me more about how you wrote books when your kids were young. So hiring the nanny was an awesome idea, it sounds like.
Sorry, go ahead.
No.
Okay, so, and to be clear, like I say nanny, I hate that word nanny. Like I hired a nanny, like this was this expendable person. Like I found this wonderful woman who was willing to take care of my child for the 4 hours, 3 days a week. And I actually ended up quitting my job because I couldn't hire a nanny. Like I just could not think about giving my newborn child to a stranger. At the time when we lived in New York, I didn't have family members. Like I literally begged my college friends who thought I was crazy for even having a baby in my 20s. And that was like 29. I was like just barely scooting across, but they thought I was insane. Mm-hmm. So I would beg different friends to be like, could you just come and watch my kid for a minute while I tried to try to write something? But so I ended up quitting my magazine job and was just freelancing, which, like I said, it took me a full year to write one article that first year. Then I got into the groove of things. But what I had to do very quickly, again, I didn't want to be that woman who I met on the playground who was like, it's just impossible. You're going to have to find another profession. You can't do it. I mean, I heard that multiple times, and that's what was driving me. I'm like, if the baby is around, if the kid is around, I can't. So I just have to figure out how I can just find X amount of hours. And because I came from deadline journalism, I did know how to write on deadlines. So I just gave myself internal deadlines. Like, you have 4 hours to get this chapter done, or you have 3 hours to, do the research for this article and get it done. And that's what I had to do. And actually, I always credit my children for two things. One, endless sources of story ideas. I mean, endless. Like almost every book I've written has something to do with my children. My memoir was about my experience in Spain and finding some sort of sense of Black identity in Spain because I married a Spaniard. Because I was like, how do I explain their existence? When they ask, like, what does it mean to be Black in Spanish? I was like, read the book, right? My fourth book, Same Family, Different Colors, was because my children are three different. They have 3 different skin tones, 3 different hair textures. They don't look alike. They don't look like me. They don't look like their father. And it's just been a part of my parenting journey to constantly be asked, like, whose kids are those? Or are you the nanny? My husband is like, oh, you adopted your children? And he's like, no. And my kids are asked all kinds of crazy questions. So it made me say, like, I'm clearly not the only person who experiences parenthood like this, but it's got to impact your parenting. And so that was the 4th book. So my children have truly inspired me, not just for my books, but for my articles and blog posts and all that kind of thing. So they've done that. And then the other thing is they've made me really efficient. I've watched people with no kids struggle to get that first book written. And I'm like, don't ever look at me and be like, I don't have time. I just can't figure it out. I was like, I don't feel sorry for you because when you have to, you do.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's important. You figure it out. And I've heard people say, like, I just stay up or I write during nap time. I need my sleep. So like, I can't stay up all night, or I'm not a morning person really. So like, I can get up at 6, but I'm not that person who's like, I was up at 4 and then no, that's not me either. But I can squeeze time out of, again, pay somebody, beg somebody, do a swap with another mom, to get your kids out of your space and use that time to your best abilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard so many mothers say that motherhood makes you much more efficient. And just exactly that thing, a book you might have sort of dipped in and out of for a few years, Once you're a mom, you're kind of like, yep, if I'm committed to this book, I have to write it, and I have to do it in these chunks of time.
Exactly.
And I'm interested, you're one of the first, I think, who's mentioned deadline-driven career and how that then plays into your efficient approach to writing. Can you talk more about the deadline-driven journalism background and how that intersects with motherhood and the efficiency that you gained there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so, I got a master's degree in journalism at Columbia University, and, being a good journalist, meeting deadlines, being accurate, being precise, all of that, you learn how to do that. And then I worked as a fact checker for the first, my first real jobs at different publications were as a fact checker, which you're the last person that kind of signs off on a story to whether or not it's all accurate. And your name is nowhere on the story, but you're the one that's going to get fired if there are mistakes because you're expendable, right? Fact checkers are expendable. So that idea of you've got to do this work and you've got to get it done fast. I worked at a monthly, and then, like I said, I worked at Entertainment Weekly. And I'll never forget I was at Entertainment Weekly as a freelancer when Frank Sinatra died. And he died on a Friday or something. And we went to the magazine went to the publisher on a Tuesday. I was in the office from Friday midnight till Tuesday, or Monday, 2 a.m, because I had to fact check his discography.
Mm-hmm.
Frank Sinatra made a lot of music.
Right.
I don't like Frank Sinatra. All I knew was Strangers in the Night. So this was oh my God. So I was literally okay, this song, and checking every title, make sure it was this date. And they were like, you deserve a real job. They hired me after that. You proved yourself. And that was my life, was this kind of deadline. It doesn't matter. You stay until it's done. If you do 2 a.m, checking again, it's a weekly. And again, that's not even daily news. This is weekly news. And it's, who's wearing what fashion item, but it still had to be super accurate. You couldn't have mistakes. So it was really drilled into me in the course of working there for those many years, precision and speed, accuracy and speed. And it has to be right and it has to be good. And even though I wasn't loving the stories that I was writing necessarily, these weren't my passion projects or anything, the skill was so good. So when I quit and went freelance, I got a reputation as being that person you could assign a story to and last minute, and she'll still get it done on time. And I credit that because of my deadline background. And even today, I've actually started doing some ghostwriting, which is usually very quick book turnaround. And same thing, it's I have a reputation of I can do this, and hopefully no editors are watching this, but they'll be we're going to give you 3 months. Do you think you can get it done? And I'm ooh, it's a stretch, but I could probably get it done in a month and a half, but I'm not going to tell them that.
Of course, yeah.
But once you kind of figure out deadline, it means you have this much time to do this much work. And it usually looks insurmountable, but you figure out how to do it by breaking things down into that means it's just when you were in high school, you're okay, I got to study this whole book. So I'm going to break it down, and I'll start on Friday and I'll be done by the time the test starts on Monday. Same concept. And once you've done it, you can, and you just apply that to whatever tiny bit of time to do a massive amount of writing.
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't always work. Like if you're really working on a beautiful novel that like just needs like slow work, it's not the same as like turning out nonfiction, for example. Like nonfiction kind of like there's a fact and you got to put it down. Even if it's creative nonfiction, there's kind of a boom, 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 boom rhythm to it. Fiction is a little more, you know, it's like more like a slow cooker, you know, you gotta marinate, and there's no way you can speed. If you try to speed up a slow cooker, it doesn't work. You get hard beans, you know, you get raw meat. It's not going to work. So it's not like this always works, but in general, like you develop these muscles of saying, yeah, I can do this fast because I've worked in environments where you had no choice. Mm-hmm. And not only was it fast, but it had to be good and accurate. So you develop a muscle, and then you can apply that to kind of any of your writing to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I want to go back to the nonfiction books that you've written in a second, but that's a good transition to the novel that you wrote. And I'm wondering how the process was different, as you mentioned, a different process for writing novels.
Well, yeah. So I'm going to say this, and then you're going to be like, oh, because it just contradicts everything I just said. But I actually wrote. So my novel is actually about a woman who hires a nanny in New York City. This woman basically had the balls that I didn't have. You know, she was living this wonderful life. She's the book is called Substitute Me, and it's about this woman who's a PR executive in New York City pre 9/11, when like everything seemed possible and you could have whatever you wanted out of life. And like she had my mentality before I had my son. But after she had her son, she was like, let's get the nanny and let's get back to like that exciting life. Mm-hmm. And the nanny, the book is told in alternating voices of the woman and then the nanny she hires. The woman is white and the nanny is black. They're both about the same age. They both come from similar backgrounds. So it's just kind of their experience of what it's like, you know, in their particular circumstances. I had this idea of writing a story about nanny culture in New York City after I confronted it and realized that I had so many different problems with it. As a Black woman, I was very much like I struggled with hiring an older Black woman to watch my children. It just felt really awkward to me. Again, like I mentioned, I just felt odd asking a stranger to be like, I hadn't grown up with nannies, right? Like my mom has 10 sisters. So there was always somebody in the family who could watch my sister or myself, right? Or my grandmother, my cousin's grandmother, you know, not related to me, but just like somebody we know. There was never this idea of like we had to hire somebody to watch us. So it wasn't even part of my comfort zone. So again, and also just being in this Brooklyn environment where there was the nannies on the playground. I mean, it was a whole cultural, social cultural like concept that I was like, this is all so interesting. And I wanted to write a nonfiction book about nanny culture in New York City, but I was having a very hard time getting any nannies to speak to me on the record. So then I was like, maybe I should turn it into fiction. Maybe I should write this scandalous like story about a nanny who's abused, but that's not the story that came to me. Like this scene popped into my head about a nanny who is better at being a mother than the mother. It was like this and this scene never actually made it into the book, but it was a very confrontational scene. And I was like, ooh. And so I had this idea and I sat on it for a while, like years, but the scene was always playing in my head. And like I mentioned before, I married a Spaniard. He's from the south of Spain. And one summer we went to the south to his parents' house. They live in a beautiful house, kind of in the middle of nowhere though. And I wrote my first draft of my novel in their house because they watched my kids. Yep. And they cooked and it was lovely. And I had this beautiful, beautiful room, this little tiny desk. And I guess I had my computer. I'm assuming I had my computer. It felt like so long ago. I was like, I had a typewriter. It wasn't that long ago. I had a computer and I didn't have the whole day or anything. Like these people were not willing to watch my kids forever. It wasn't like a writing retreat, but it was like between getting up and the 2:00 lunch meal, I could write. And I had bought Walter Mosley's book, This Is the Year You Will Write Your Novel, which I recommend to everybody. Followed his like outline, do this, like this is what you do and you'll be done. And I had an outline before I came to Spain. And I sat down and I wrote, and I was like, it's working. It's working. I'm actually writing a novel. It's so exciting. And I printed it out in my father-in-law's office. When I left, I actually had a full draft. And I think it was a month that I turned it out. Now, there were 17 other drafts after that, but the first draft, 3 weeks to a month, done.
That's amazing.
Again, it's like, when is I going to have childcare like that? And food, so delicious.
Yeah, someone else cooking for you. No kidding. You said before this conversation you were putting on your slow cooker, right, or your crock pot.
Yep. So it's cooking while we're talking.
Exactly. Yep. I laid out snacks for my daughter, and now I'm here. You do what you gotta do, right?
Multitask. Like whoever invented the slow cooker, the crock pot. Now I got a. What do you got? No, I thought, yeah, like a crock pot. I have a supersonic crock pot. Whoever invented that was so smart.
Oh yeah, they were probably a mom. If
I'm
not
sure.
a writer mom, definitely a mom.
Maybe. I mean, it's just the smartest thing. Like, and it took me so long to like incorporate that into my schedule. My mom was like, "Why don't you get a crock pot? Then you could just have the food." Because I'd always be like, "We're eating dinner at 10:30, Mom." She's like, "Why?" I was like, "Because that's what time dinner was done." She said, "Why don't you get a crock pot?" I was like, "I don't want." When I was like, "Oh my God, this is a genius thing."
Oh yeah, I'm still holding out. My mom keeps telling me the same thing. I'm like, I don't want to leave it on all day, and like, but
get one.
Totally. Oh,
amazing.
So, what was your mom like? You said she's one of 11 girls.
10 sisters and one brother.
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, poor brother. Yeah. So, what kind of mom is your mom?
I always credit my mom with making me a writer because she bought me a typewriter when I was 8. She had this habit of, I shouldn't say had, she still does, of going to, I'm from Wisconsin. I don't know what people call them in every state, but we call them rummage sales. So like yard sales, tag sales, depending what part of the country you live in. But she loved to go to yard sales. And when I was 8, she came home with a typewriter, an antique big box, Remington typewriter. And it's sitting right here next to me, actually. If my computer moved, I would show you, but I can't. So, and to this day, I'm like, why did you give it to me? I have an older sister. I'm like, I was 8. She gave it to me. My sister probably would have put it to better use, not abused it as much as I did, and she doesn't know. She can't say for sure. Like I never was talking about being a writer or anything like that, but my mom gave me this typewriter, and that's when I fell in love with the idea of being a writer. And my mother, God bless her, I love my mom so much. My mom's a therapist. She's a she was a nurse. She's a psychotherapist. She actually ended her career as a cultural anthropology professor. She was always getting new degrees, and she was just a very she had a subscription to Natural History magazine, and anything you would ask, it would always go back to the animal kingdom, or to nature. She could explain all things by my brother and I were laughing, and my brother is 8 years younger than me, and we got the same stories, asking about why is it wrong to have sex, when you're young or whatever, and she would be like, so the badger, the badger. Well, I don't even remember. There's something about a badger having an erection for hours, and somehow that was the story. But we're both like, I don't remember the point of the story. I just remember the part about the badger having an erection for a really long time. But everything, you're like, what does this have to do with anything? And she's like, adolescent elephants, you go like that. So my mom and all of her sisters were amazing storytellers. Every time they get together, it's always people laughing and telling, which I found out much later that most of their stories were highly exaggerated. But there's just stories. There's stories, and my mom would, again, some people would just call my mom a liar. She's not a liar at all. She just exaggerates a lot. But she has such great stories from being a nurse. There's also again, my siblings and I can all be like, yeah, remember the escalator, the patient that lacerated his liver on the escalator because he didn't tie his shoes when he was walking up the escalator. So we all now my kids, I'm like, tie your shoes. Most of the kids don't even have ties on their shoes anymore. But it's always like, don't trip on the escalator because you could lacerate your liver. And here we are, middle-aged people ourselves, and we're still like, yeah, the lacerated liver story. So many stories.
Oh my God, that's amazing. That's amazing.
But my mom, I have to say, also was like, she worked so much and did so much. She was a busy, like, highly educated in the sense, like I said, she was always going back to school for something or another, but she was such a good mom. Like, she cooked, she baked, she sewed. She had 3 of us, and she made us all feel like, I never felt like my mom's work was more important to her, even though I know her work was important, like very important. I mean, she was saving people's lives. We knew all her patients' names and things like that. But I felt like she loved us so much. Like, I never, ever, ever felt like we were in the way. As an adult, I realized we were in the way. Like, she could have done a lot more, but she never made us feel like that. And I just feel so grateful that she made us a priority, even while she was pursuing her own, passions. And that's like, I posted on Twitter that I was doing this talk, and I said that you can be a writer and a mother, but they're both total, like, to be a really good writer, I feel like you don't want to have kids because you want to be completely consumed. And when you are, I mean, I get completely consumed in my story, and I want to write, and I don't want to go. My daughter's like, you want to go play in the snow with me? And I'm like, not really. No, I want to finish revising my novel because I'm in it. But then that means I'm not being a good mom. So it's that being able to be like a deadline journalist where you're like, okay, you're going to have to be like, now this is the time for the novel, and you're going to have to come out, even though the best thing is when you're in the flow is to keep going. Mm-hmm. Because the last thing I want, like some people say, I don't believe when people are like, your children want to see you happy. No, they don't. They want to be happy. That's such bullshit. Are we allowed to swear? I'm so sorry.
Go for it.
I think that is the biggest crock of dookie that anybody has ever told somebody, to be like, your kids want you to be happy. I mean, theoretically, but no, they don't. Like, children are hardwired to be selfish. They want them to be happy. They don't have that altruistic, like, as long as my mom's happy, I'm fine being ignored. No, if they had it their way, mommy and daddy would be like the whole time, like giving them all of their attention. They want the birthday party. They want and it's not even about wanting stuff, but they want mom to be like, listen to all the stories I have in my head. You want to hear what I dreamt last night? You want to, and if you're like, they don't want you to be working. Like, that's not true. Like, that is not true at all. And, like, they want mommy to go on this business trip. No, they don't. They want you home. That doesn't mean that you can't, figure out how to, go on the business trip or, go on the writer's retreat or whatever you have to do. But don't fool yourself and be like, my kid wants this for me. They want to see me get that Pulitzer, or they want to, So your books want all of you, and your kids want all of you, and you have to figure out, maybe it's seasonally, right? Like, your kids get you in the summer, but come academic year, you're kind of more about the books. Mm-hmm. Or maybe it's every other year. I get a book a year and a kid. The kids are fully focused.
That would be nice if you could parcel it out that way. Yeah.
But it is like, they're both fully all consuming. Mm-hmm. Maybe your book isn't as good as it could have been if you could have been 100% in it all the time. But it's probably good enough. And your kid is, kids are super resilient. So like, if you slough off for maybe year 1 through year 4, probably it's going to be okay. They're not going to remember. But if you ignored them for 4 years, they'll remember and they won't develop properly. Their brains won't be right. My mom just told me, if you hug your children, they get their better brain development. She's like, I just found that out. So make sure you're hugging your
children. Yeah.
So,
and it's balanced too. It sounds like that's what you're saying. Like, if you have kids and you're a writer, then you can't be 100% for both at the same time, right? So
exactly. It's not, and that's what it's not impossible at all. It's just, you have to figure out, and I feel like you can train your children in a way that's like, when mommy's in her writing room, you have to respect that or something. And of course, it's not going to hurt. Like, I did a writer's retreat just for a week. And again, because I'm supersonic, like, I got a lot done because I'm like, I can't do that writer's retreat for a month. Like, that's not, like, you can't say, oh, my kids don't care, I'm gone for a month. Like, yes, they do. That's a lot of, I mean, if it's a 16-year-old, I'm sure maybe he or she won't care. But a younger child is going to miss you desperately if you're gone for a month. But that doesn't mean maybe you can't go for a week or 10 days, especially if the kid is with grandma or auntie or somebody who's equally effusive and can really show that kid some love. So it is a balance. No, I don't like to use that word balance because that would seem that there's some sort of equality there.
That's true, yeah.
It's not necessarily a balance. It's just figuring out what works and recognizing that these are like, your books are your children and your children are your children. And if you have more than one, then you know that you have to balance that too. You can't, you got to give kid A solo time and you got to give kid B solo time, right? And then also, if you look at some of the greatest writers, they had kids, or some of the, maybe your most prolific writers, some of them have a lot of kids. Like, I think Jodi Picoult has like, I don't know, 4 or 5 kids.
Yeah.
She's got like 87 books. Like, it's totally doable. It's totally doable. It's not something that's impossible at all. That's why that woman who said, you're never going to be able to do it. That's not the message at all. But they're both very, like, soul thought consuming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I definitely see that. I think you're right. What preconceptions did you have based on the way that your mother mothered you about what kind of mother you wanted to be? And are you that type of mother that you expected you would be?
I try. My mom said, like I said, she set such a good example. Yeah. I can't sew. I can't knit. I don't have any of those handicrafts that she can do. And that makes me very sad. Like, I can knit, and I've taught my daughter how to knit. Like, but when I say I can knit, I know how to make like a long thing. It's not even a scarf. It's just a long thing. My mom could play the piano. Like, she knew all the things that like women are supposed to learn how to do. And I mean, and she can knit anything. She can sew anything. She sewed herself a dress, and then like she made my doll's dress out of the same material. Like, it was so cute. She made my Halloween costumes. So she was very creative, and she literally was like, I don't understand why you can't do this. If there's direction somewhere, like, my mom could fix a vacuum cleaner as long as she looked at the directions. Although she did blow a hole up in the wall once. She thought she fixed the vacuum cleaner and plugged it in. It was like, boom. But for the most part, if there are directions she could figure, she could hang wallpaper. She could do anything. But so like that, and again, like I said, she always made us feel very loved. She baked this lovely cake. She never used mixes for anything. Like, everything was from scratch. So that's the kind of mom I wanted to be. And I think I'm close to it, but not as close. I mean, I'm not I don't think I'm as good of a homemaker as my mom. My mom knows how to fold sheets, so they're all smooth. She knows how to do laundry, get the spots out. I don't know how to. I buy my kids all dark blue clothes. Like, that's my secret. That's my tip. And like, when my boys were younger, like, all their clothes look exactly alike, so I didn't even have to be like, which one is theirs? I don't know. It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
But I wanted to make my children feel loved. Like, wanted them, like, like Valentine's Day, where I make them a special meal. It's not about like, let me go out with my husband, or let me, it's about dating romance. It's like, I love you guys. Let's all have a special, like, I'll make cupcakes or something for them. So I remember one time my mom, it was rain. I don't know why she did this. Like, I honestly don't know, but she just came home one day, and for dinner, we put a blanket on the floor in our, we had like a sunroom, and we put a blanket on the floor. It was raining outside, and she had brought home a baguette, hard salami, brie, and chocolate cupcakes. And we had like, that was our dinner. And it was just like, oh my God, it's so cool. I still remember that meal. I must have been like 9 or 10 at the most. And it was just so fun. So like, she did cool stuff like that. And she made sure that we had all these really amazing experiences. Like, she made sure, like, my sister and I both studied abroad when we were in high school. Like, we were exchange students. I was an exchange student to Morocco. My sister went to France. And my mom never traveled like that, but she made sure that we did. you know? So I learned, like, that's what I got from my mom, is to, you know, try to do more for my children than, that's not even true. Not even more. I had a pretty awesome childhood. So I just wanted to give my children, you know, kind of the same types of experiences as much as I could. But again, I think the most important thing that my mom did was make me feel like I was not her everything, in the sense that she had to sacrifice, but just that, like, I was loved, you know? And that's what I wanted to do. And also, like, this family, like, family was so important. And that's what I've tried to do with my kids too.
Yeah, no, it sounds like you're doing all of those things, you know, in your own way, including writing books inspired by your experience with your children. Tell us about, so let's see, I'm just looking. I think, was it, all right, Kinky Gazpacho? That was the one about you and your husband. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so tell us just a little bit more about the story of Kinky Gazpacho, and have your kids read it? Like, what did they take from it, or what do you hope they'll take from it?
You know, so I wrote that book, like I said, it was my second book. Kinky Gazpacho was my second book.
Mm-hmm.
And having my son, my first son, I felt like my husband and I met in Spain. I had always thought that I was going to live in Spain just because, you know, of high school fantasies and things like that. But when I spent my junior year of college in Spain, and I had a wonderful experience, but I found it to be really difficult to be a Black person in Spain at the time. And that was mostly because of just what we would call microaggressions today. That word didn't exist then, but this really, like, lack of understanding of the Black experience. Wherever I went, you know, I was in a smaller town, but everywhere I went, people would point at me and call me, like, negrita or chocolate. Like, they would just, like, say stupid things to me. And I was used to being, like, the only Black person in a space because I grew up in Wisconsin. I went to women's college in Massachusetts. Like, being the only Black person in space wasn't new to me, but being pointed at and stared at and called crazy names, these names weren't offensive, but, like, being called out on the street. Like, you're just walking down the street and everybody's gonna be like, hey, look, it's a Black person, you know, like, what? It was so annoying that I was like, oh my God, I never want to go back to Spain. But I married a Spaniard, and then I had a child with a Spaniard, which meant I was going to go back to Spain. So I was, like, obsessed with figuring out how do I reconcile my feelings, because I don't feel positively about Spain anymore, like I did as a naive, you know, high school, college student. And so that's what I kind of set out to do, was try to figure out how do I find something good about being Black in Spain. And so Kinky Gazpacho was kind of that search. And it ended up with me discovering that Spain had a Black history, that Spain had African slaves, not Moroccan people, not Moors, but actually Black African slaves of the same people who were enslaved in the United States were enslaved in Spain from West Africa. You know, it's like, it's possible that my ancestors could also have, you know, relatives who ended up in Spain instead of in the southern part of the United States. And that, like, unearthing that history, it wasn't just the history, but it was figuring out how much of Spanish culture actually derives from African culture, like the same culture where, you know, my ancestry is from, was like a revelation. And I started realizing that there was a lot more of me in Spain. And that's the end of the story. So it's me coming to terms with what does it mean to be Black in general, and then what does it mean to be a Black person in Spain. And, you know, ultimately it's about, you know, it's your own, you define that for yourself. Nobody can define it for you. And actually, if it wasn't my life, I would want my children to read it, but it's embarrassing because I write all the embarrassing things, and I'm not ready for them to know all of my flaws, you know, like,
Sure.
I'm not ready for them to be like, so you did what when you were in high school? You know, I thought you said, because, you know, you gloss over some things in your life. You don't want your children to know all the things. So, speaking of children, I was supposed to just, I'm sorry, I'm pausing in the middle of this interview because my son is supposed to be in a Spanish class as we're speaking. And I was supposed to send him the link, which I forgot to do. So I'm literally just forwarding it thing because
That's fine. That's what this is all about. So not a
parenting
problem at
is
all.
all about, right?
No, it's fine. Yeah.
um. Anyway, so the book Kinky Gazpacho, I haven't let them read it yet, but one day I will want them to read it. And actually, if my 19-year-old wanted to read it, I'd be perfectly happy for him to read it. But I found like my boys are not that interested. They both read my first book, Hair Story. They definitely read that. And they've read parts of Same Family, Different Colors, which has some of our family story in it, but it's not so much me, me personally. But I want them to see that they have a connection, not just the fact that their father is Spanish, but that there's a Black connection in Spain too, because it's not going to be obvious when they get there. People in Spain still haven't kind of acknowledged their Black history very much. Like there's no Black History Month in Spain, and people are not as like overtly racist as there's not like people aren't going to just automatically say, oh, we don't like you because you're Black or anything like that. But they're not necessarily going to embrace the brown skin and say, oh, yes, we know where this comes from, or we know what it means to be Black, and we have some sort of appreciation for Blackness in our country. So I do appreciate the fact that this book exists and that when they're ready, they can read it and have some, I guess, prep work done for them, if you will. Yeah. And of course, I tell them all this stuff. It's not like they have to read the book. They can get the crib notes from me. But I want other people, particularly other Black people, and I am happy to see that book came out in 2008. I'm really happy to see Black women, particularly college students, who are doing their junior year of college in Spain, people who are, Black women who are traveling to Spain, reach out to me like, I read your book. It was so helpful. Thank you so much. Which is great because I wrote that memoir because it was inspired by Lorraine Carey's book, Black Ice, because she was writing about what it was like to be a Black woman at a white private school. It was a boarding school, but reading that made me feel so much better going to a private school. Like I was like, oh my gosh, someone who has the same like feelings as me and the same experiences. And I remember when Kinky Gazpacho, the day before it was about to hit store shelves, I literally like had a panic attack and like crawled in bed. I was like, nobody's going to want to read this. Like, who's going to want to read this? What are the Black women in Spain? Like, this is so ridiculous. Like, I can't even believe that they're publishing this book. It's so nobody's going to care. And the response to the book, besides these, like over the years, having different Black women who are in Spain read it, so many people who just felt like a fish out of water or looking for themselves in different places, responded to me, which made me feel like I write because I want to make people feel seen in some way, shape, or form. And that book really did that. It's not as specific as I thought. That's the idea of memoir, right? The universality in these stories. So, so that's that. I wish I could give it to my kids because I know they need it. But from me, it's like nobody wants to learn from their mother, right? Like if someone else wrote a version of Kinky Gazpacho, I would get it for my kids in a second because we're actually, going to be moving to Spain soon. And that is something that I want them to be like mentally prepared for on a deeper level.
Yeah, no, and that leads into Same Family, Different Colors too, and what you were saying about, so all of your kids have different skin tones, as you mentioned. Tell me about what is it about that experience and about people's reactions to them and to you and to your husband that you were talking about earlier on that made it feel urgent to write this book?
So I've been blogging since I've been a mother, pretty much. I started my blog, My American Melting Pot, I think in like 2006. And when I would write about things that happened to me as a Black mother who had children who looked not Black, so many people would respond and be like, oh my gosh, that's happened to me. And they weren't all Black, it was white women who had, married an Asian man, or an Asian woman who married a Black man, just all these different things. And so that was always like, I knew that I could write about that. I knew I could go to my like online community and have people understand what I was talking about. And for me, my books are always the things that just won't leave me alone. You know, the things that just keep coming up again and again and again. And just like Kinky Gazpacho, I thought this was a very finite thing that just a few people, you know, the people who read my blog, connected with. But I felt like the conversation that I was having about my own family and this, like, you know, we were in a restaurant and the waitress was like, table for two, because my son and I were here and my husband was behind me with my daughter and my other son. And it was like, we're all together. Like, we're literally standing all bunched together. And it was like, these things would happen so frequently, you know, where people just didn't make the connection that we were a family. I actually have t-shirts that say same family, different colors. And like, put your shirt on so everybody knows that we're together. And these things just kept coming up. And then I would see them talked about in other situations. You know, I'd see transracially adopted families have these types of conversations. I would see, you know, a good friend of mine adopted a child. Like, my friend is Korean and she adopted her daughter from Korea. But her adopted daughter had darker skin than the other children in the family. And other Koreans like would comment on it, like very openly, in a way that I was like, what? Is that okay to do? You're not supposed to do that. And so I'm seeing all of this, you know, it's coming together, it's connecting, it's making those connections. And because it was happening again in families that look like mine, families that look like my Korean friends, families that look like my Black friends who were Black, but somebody came out much later. I'm like, there's something here. And every time, like I said, that it doesn't let me go, then I'm like, I got to do something about it. And really and truly, like at the very, very base of it is like, I wanted to ask everybody, how are you handling it? Mm-hmm. But I can't just knock on someone's door or attack them in their grocery store and be like, unless I have a book to be writing, like I'm writing this book, do you mind if I ask you some questions? And so it really was like my own need and desire to ask other parents, how do you deal with this? As well as to ask people who I know who grew up like that, how did it affect you? You know, do you feel any kind of way because of the fact that different people, like your family members, were different skin tones? Were you treated differently? And there was the gamut of, nope, I feel fine, everything is great, to my brother's in jail, I'm a college professor, my parents treated my darker skinned brother like this and me because I'm lighter skinned like this, and look how it's turned out. Mm. Because I was living it, I recognized how significant this issue was. And what really was the like turning point for me was the Trayvon Martin court case. And when that felt like the beginning of open season of Black men being indiscriminately shot, which of course it wasn't. It's been happening in the United States forever. But that felt like the time when you had to explain it to your children, and especially if you had Black male children, which at the time I had two. But one child looks Black and one doesn't look that Black. And that's when it hit me how serious of an issue it was, the fact that my kids don't look alike and that one is darker than the other. This is not just funny, maybe one needs more sunscreen than the other. This is, how do you tell one child that they're a marked man and the other one has the freedom and innocence of just being a child? Mm. That's not insignificant.
Yep. How did you approach that? How did you have those conversations?
I wrote the book and then I had conversations, because I did a lot of talking and researching and having to go inside myself and figure out, like, what do I really, there is no right answer. Mm-hmm. But what I ended up deciding, like how I dealt with it, was to say, you know, both of my children are Black. You know, the pigment in their skin doesn't designate them as Black. So they both get the quote unquote talk. I have not, at the time they were much younger, so I wasn't instilling in them a sense of, like, you know, I didn't tell them, you know, keep your hands on the steering wheel. I mean, that's not where they were. But like, I wasn't willing to be like, you can't wear hoodies, but you can. Like, I did not want to create a wedge between my sons about who was privileged and who wasn't. Of course, they're not blind. And as they've gotten older, they kind of joke about it. But one thing that I did do was make sure that we always acknowledged the differences. We didn't try to say, you're all the same. I mean, I was like, I love you the same, but like, yeah, my older son looks more like me. My younger son, sometimes we joke and say like, you go in the store because you look white. Go on, you do it first. You go first or something like that. And we do. We talk about like, well, whose skin tone looks like what, and whose looks like this, who looks like that, who matches, who doesn't match. And we spent a lot of time normalizing the fact that our family members are all different colors and different hair textures. And then these fools go to a new school together, and people are like, are you guys twins? That's like, what? Here I am like, you guys are different. It's okay, you're different. And people are like, are you guys twins? They're 3 years apart. One's dark, one's light, one's skinny, one's a little thicker. Like, they don't look alike at all, in my opinion. And I mean, they're like Ernie and Bert. They don't look alike at all. And people like, are they twins?
Oh my gosh.
So, which goes all the way back to this idea of like, you have to do what's best for your family, because on the one hand, you could do nothing and it could backfire. But on the other hand, you could do all this prep work and then people think they're twins. The main thing is to make sure that your children feel confident and comfortable in the skin they're in, because for one reason or another, they're sure to be confronted about something about the way they look. And if you have instilled in them that they are perfect, this is the way that God made them, or whoever you believe, or however you say that, then, then they're more prepared for whatever comes their way. And that's essentially what you want to do. And I think that was the takeaway from that book, is that for all the people I interviewed, some had really sad stories. The ones who had positive stories really could just attribute it to their parents making them feel perfectly normal, whatever skin tone they had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just about to ask you how writing the book prepared you for those conversations, and I think you just answered that. Yeah, unless you want to go a little more into that, like, how do you remember a specific story that resonated with you, that you thought about, that you had in the back of your head when having those conversations specifically with your sons?
I think it was actually more with my daughter, because I think I felt it more painfully with my daughter, because I think we all expect our same sex, same gendered children to look like us in some way. And my daughter looks nothing like me. She didn't for the first 2 years. In fact, somebody literally asked me if I adopted her from China. They were like, I didn't know Black people adopted from China. I was like, they probably weird. Can, but my daughter's not adopted from China. Like, they really thought she was Chinese. Like, people thought she was so pale and her hair was so straight when she was born. And for the first 6 months, 7, 8, 9 months, and then her hair kind of bent a little bit. But I was like, who is this baby? And how did I get her? And so as she got older, she would be like, she would pick up her hand, and say like, who do I look like? And she would say things like, Dad, Poppy's pink. Like, she wanted colors for everybody, and she wanted us to be the same. And I wanted us to be the same, but we're not the same. So the psychologist, one of the psychologists that I interviewed for the book, that was her term, was to normalize difference. Normalize difference. Make that, like flowers in a garden. There's roses and daisies and tulips, and they're all different colors, and that's what makes the garden so beautiful. And so I find myself using a lot of that kind of phrasing when I would talk to her. And that's why we would do things like, you're the color of a garbanzo, and you're the color of a toasted almond. And what color do you think I am? And she would say cinnamon dusted hummus,
Oh.
so it became this thing of like, what do you think you're the same color as, and what are you the color of? So that's what we would do, and that's what we did for a long time, always kind of at the dinner table. And the one thing she would just never like, Poppy could not be white. He was pink. He was pink or something, whatever, but it was never white. He was pink. Or couldn't he be like light? My husband is super pale. My husband is like, he's like, he could be your brother or sister. Like, I mean, he's your complexion, dark hair, pale skin. And everyone's like, he's Spanish or Russian? I'm like, he's Spanish, really. He's from the South, I swear. But my daughter just won't see him as white. Because she wants us to all be some variation of brown. So she'll be like, he's like super light brown. I'm like, super brown. Yeah. Light brown. But that did help, that idea of normalizing difference. And, the psychologist was like, when you do that, when they go out in the world, if somebody says, why does your family look like that? They're like, why doesn't yours? Because for them, this is normal. And anybody who doesn't get that has some learning to do. They're not going to make my daughter feel badly. They're just going to be, like, have to teach people this is just what we look like, and there's nothing bizarre about that. Yeah. So that helped me a lot, because my instinct would be to be like, we all are kind of the same. We're all pretty much the same, right? We're all kind of like brownish, right? Instead of being like, no, you're this color, you're this color, you're this color, and that's kind of cool. And that's what it is.
Tell me, so you said that you started out writing your blog, American Melting Pot, about a lot of these issues about race and motherhood, and then recently you moved away from that and you wanted to write more, or just talk more and write more about books. And I know that's something you wanted to talk about. And since we have a few minutes here remaining before the hour ends, tell me about that decision to move toward books.
So, okay. So because of 2020 being the just horrific experience that it was, to say that it was stressful is an understatement, right? And my blog has always been a platform to talk about race and racism, but in an approachable and accessible way. I used to say that I like to celebrate diversity, and obviously you can't talk about diversity without talking about race or racism, but that's not what my goal wasn't, to talk about racism. It was to talk about diversity. Mm-hmm. And I launched a podcast to accompany the blog in 2018 with the same mission. But because the podcast felt a little bit more public facing, I guess, I feel like I couldn't talk to people and not be mentioning what was happening in the world. And after George Floyd's murder and I call it the Black Lives Matter 2.0 movement, I just felt it was my responsibility to really drill down on anti-racism work. And I did that. I did a special series called Don't Be Racist. Before that, I was doing like revolutionary reading series. I was doing all kinds of things to kind of to combat the racism that seemed to be just oozing into this world after the presidency of Donald Trump. And, when 2020 came to an end and everybody's kind of licking their wounds and praying that 2021 was going to bring some sort of hope, relief, cure for COVID, I just asked myself, I actually was preparing for the next season of My American Melting Pot. I was going to talk about different things about diversity. I was trying to figure out what to do. And I was participating in a challenge, like a creativity challenge. And question was asked, what would you, if you could do anything, write about, talk about, whatever your creative thing is, and you didn't have to worry that it wasn't going to be money making or that people were going to judge you, what would you do? And it came to me, I would talk about books all the time. I just love books and writing. Yeah. And if I could do that, I would. And I'm thinking, well, it's my podcast. Nobody's paying me to do it. So why don't you do that? There's nothing stopping you. But then it was but I have a responsibility to end racism in the world. But I'm clearly not ending racism in the world. And doing a podcast, as I'm sure you know, it's hard. It's a lot of work. There's a lot of pieces to put together. And I just found myself not wanting to get into it because it just was like, the heaviness. And so I love podcasting. So I decided to podcast about something I love to make it more enjoyable. And my birthday was yesterday, and which is, close to the beginning of the year. And I'm like, what am I waiting for? Like retirement to like do something that brings me joy? No. So my podcast now is, I'm calling it Melting Pot Stories so that I don't change my URL. It's like I have built up something around the Melting Pot name, so I didn't change the name. But I call it a literary love fest for multicultural books. And essentially, we talk about multicultural stories. I have authors come on that have written about like authors of color and or people who are writing about, different cultures connecting or clashing. I have an author coming this Saturday. I'm interviewing Jennifer Steele, who wrote this wonderful novel called Exile Music. And it's about a Jewish family in World War II Austria who ends up fleeing to Bolivia. And this is based on not a true story, but on the exodus of Austrian Jews who ended up in Bolivia, which I never heard of that group, of that connection. And so she'll be coming on the show. And what I really want to do is like talk about the stories behind the stories, right? So not giving away the ending of the books, not making it dependent on you having read the book for this to be interesting, but really talking to the authors about, what compelled them to write these stories, the cultures that we're talking about in the books. And then also I do a little just talking about books that I'm reading and literary tea in the publishing world. And yeah, I've only done 3 episodes so far with the new topics, but I'm so excited about it. Every day I think of, like when I was doing my seasons before, I was like, okay, I think I can get 8 seasons in before I got to take a break. Now I'm like, oh my God, I have like 20 different things that I want to talk about. So I think I'll be on forever. Like, can I do 2 shows a week? This is crazy because there's so much in my little head that I want to talk about. And there's always something, a new book, a re-release or somebody doing something like a book club. There's another podcast that I just heard about that other people should know about. There's your podcast, like this. Do you call this a web series? Is this a web series?
I don't know what I call it. It's a conversation series.
A conversation series. So like this, it's like just telling people what's going on. People like me who love books, like who geek out on books and writing. That's who my show is for. And it just brings me joy. And I just want to, spread the word and find other people like me who just want to hear about multicultural books. And they're books like kids' books too, not just adult books, but kids' books, nonfiction and fiction. So I'm having like Joanna Ho come on to talk about her new kids' book, Eyes That Kiss at the Corners, which is a lovely book. So anyway, I could go on and on because I have so many. I'm so excited to do this, and I hope my enthusiasm brings people to listen in.
Oh, I definitely will be, although I have listened in. Remind me, I know I have it somewhere, but remind me of the URL, and I'll put it down here in the banner.
Thank you. It's My American Melting Pot is the name of the show. And the blog is myamericanmeltingpot.com, and you can find links to the show on the website, or you can find My American Melting Pot, the podcast, on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, like all the places.
All the places.
There. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Everyone check it out. And thank you so much for coming on today. This has been so fun and just thought-provoking. And thank you for your honest conversation and for your enthusiasm. It's just been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. It's been great. I love talking about writing and motherhood.
As do I. And thank you all for joining in tonight, too. I know a number of you were out there. And for those of you who will be listening in or watching later, thank you for checking out the conversation. So a reminder, you can watch the video again, listen to the episode as a podcast, or read the transcript on writermothermonster.com. You can also go to that link and find our bookshop shelf where you can find Lori's books as well as the books by all of our other authors collected right there for sale on bookshop.com. And if you enjoyed the conversation, as always, please consider becoming a patron or patroness on Patreon. And thank you all. We'll see you next week. Lori, stick around for a second so I can say goodbye. And thanks, everyone.